The question there is, what does the organization do when it faces an unignorable moment? Our counsel is to really use these unignorable moments, right, as an opportunity to reflect on your culture. Remember the importance of culture as both an asset for your organization and as an arena to look for change opportunities. We think culture and strategy are very closely related processes. You can have the best strategy on paper, but if you don't have a culture that can take that strategy forward, and a culture that's aligned to the strategic change you need, then it's not worthy of having that great strategy.
Nuevas Posibilidades. Conversaciones que inspiran nuevas formas de innovar en los negocios. Today we are joined by a remarkable figure at the intersection of social sciences and executive management, Dr. Barry Dornfeld. Barry, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for having me on, Oscar. Excited to do this.
Yeah. Barry is a principal at CFAR, a strategic management consulting and executive coaching firm that originated as the only multidisciplinary applied research center at the Wharton School of Business. From the vantage point, Barry has spent decades advising leaders in highly complex sectors, including healthcare, higher education, and major nonprofits, helping them navigate challenges where culture and strategy often collide. What makes Barry a truly disruptive voice is his foundational training. He's both an anthropologist and a documentary filmmaker. He holds a BA in anthropology and economics, he holds a BA in anthropology and economics from Tufts University and a PhD in communication from the Annenberg School of the University of Pennsylvania. This unique background allows him to apply a rigorous ethnographic lens to listen between the lines and ask questions that no one else is asking in the boardroom. He's also the co-author of the book, The Moment You Can Ignore, When Big Trouble Leads to a Great Future, and we will talk about it in this interview, a seminal work for understanding how moments of crisis can be turned into a company's greatest lever for innovation. Barry, it's an honor to have you on the show to discuss how anthropological lens can activate the potential of the most complex organizations.
Great. Thank you, Oscar. Yeah, I think I'm looking forward to the conversation. I love the topic and I love the dialogue, so thank you.
Mm-hmm. So let's start with this question. How is it that you end up being a business anthropologist and working with organizations, doing what you are good at in asking questions, communication, anthropology, organizational culture? How do you end up doing this?
Yeah, it was a great question, and it's a bit of a life journey, but it took me to a really fascinating place and a number of great experiences. I started my career in higher education as a professor, taught at NYU and New York University in New York City, a wonderful program there on culture and media. And as you mentioned, I was doing work with documentary film and video and audio, and teaching in those areas, and also using ethnography to study media. So one of the threads of my background is in what used to be called visual anthropology, now sometimes called media anthropology, and this would be people who are using ethnographic tools, ethnographic perspectives to look at how media is made. So this, in some ways, was a kind of an omen of the work that I would move on to later on. But I had done it as my dissertation research in my first book, an ethnographic study of the making of a public broadcasting documentary series. This is some years ago, that was produced by WNET, a big public broadcasting station, important PBS station in New York City. And this production was called Childhood, and it looked globally at childhood and child rearing. And I was able to, through the generosity of the executive producers and others there, was able to get an inside look at how this series was made and talked to the producers and observed and was part of the crew. So it was an early example of organizational ethnography, even before I had gotten into the organizational consulting world. So that was my first kind of taste of this, and then I was teaching at New York University. And then for a series of reasons, both professional and personal, was attracted to look outside of academia, and I know a lot of people in the U.S. Have also made that bridge, and people in business anthropology and organizational anthropology have looked outside of the academy for their place of employment. So I was lucky to find CFAR, the Center for Applied Research, and I had actually known some people from my graduate work in my graduate school days at the University of Pennsylvania, including Mal O'Connor, who was the colleague you mentioned. He and I co-wrote the book, The Moment You Can't Ignore. Mal and I had worked on some ethnographic projects earlier on when we were both graduate students at Penn. So I reached out to Mal and others and found that the Center for Applied Research, that CFAR, this consulting group, might be an interesting fit for me. So jumped into it. I didn't know much at the time about consulting, although obviously I had worked looking at organizations from an anthropological lens. So I jumped in and started to learn about the practices of consulting. And CFAR was a great place to make that transition from academia to organizational work, because it is a consulting firm, it's a business, but it also is a business that brings in academic work, applied academic work, brings in the best thinking from organizational theory and business applications, strategy, change, and takes that thinking, those ideas, and puts them to work helping organizations. So I made a transition to become an organizational or business anthropologist at that time, and had a lot to learn about consulting, but it was a great group of colleagues that helped me on that journey. And now here I am, about 25 years later, one of the senior members of the firm. Yeah. So,
Yeah. Now you are quite the expert.
Well, I don't know about that, but certainly I have the gray hairs to show that I've been at it for a while, right?
So, derived from your experience at CFAR, is that motivated you to write the book, The Moments You Can Ignore?
Yeah, and I can give you a little
Or how did the book came about?
I'll give you a little background on that. So, I've been at CFAR, 7-8 years, and Mal O'Connor, my colleague, really is the one who started the book project, so I really have to give credit to him. And he wanted to write a book that looked at our work on culture and change, and CFAR, had done work across industries in those areas, and also had brought, some original thinking and had developed some tools and methods to work on culture and change that were a little different than some of the typical methods out there in the business world, although there's some great others, of course, who work in those areas. So we thought we had something distinctive to say about how you think about culture in organizations and help organizations change with culture in mind. So Mal had started this idea, and then I joined him as a co-author. And we spent a lot of time developing the ideas in the book and developing the casework in the book. And you'll see, I know you know the book, Oscar, and others, take a look at it. There are cases from a number of different industries, because CFAR does work across industries. So certainly we have our healthcare work represented there, our work in higher education, but also our work with family businesses and work in the corporate world. So we wanted to represent the way we thought about change and culture in all of those settings, but really done from the perspective of organizational anthropologists. Mal had been trained in folklore. I had been trained in anthropology and communication. So we brought our backgrounds together and wrote the book to really make something hopefully readable for business executives. It wasn't intended to be a very academic book, although it hopefully has some academic rigor in it, but really was a way to share our ideas on culture and change that we thought were worth putting to paper.
No, definitely, it's a very fascinating reading, and I think it has a very thoughtful balance between theory and and some practical cases. And what I really like is that this this insight about that when a company suffers a moment that they cannot ignore, is because it's a sign that the current culture is not longer functional or is no longer adequate in order to thrive and in order to grow and in order to go on. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah,
I
please.
think
No, I'm glad you. Yeah,
yeah, I
yeah,
think
yeah.
that
No,
for me that part was very revealing. Even
mm,
though that I have worked
great.
myself with many companies, and I
Yeah,
see the the, the problems or the challenges that they face, uh, but uh, but the way you presented in the book is so clear. It's crystal clear. It's like, oh yeah, of course, it's a sign. It's a sign that the current culture is no longer functional.
yeah. No, thank you. And yes, it was fascinating to kind of have that idea really emerge through our thinking and bringing in our colleagues at CFAR and others. Because we felt then, and this is now more than 10 years ago, that the book was first published, and even before that, as we were doing the thinking, even then we thought there was a real change going on in organizations more broadly. Some of the old models of leadership, of organizational structure, of culture, as you say, were breaking down, and there was an opportunity for an emerging of some new thinking and new approaches. And as you said, often this shows up for an organization as an unignorable moment. And the idea of that is that organizations, when they are facing an unignorable moment, are really facing some disruptive change in their
Hmm.
organization. And it could be in strategy, it could be in business success, it could be changes in a family business when there's a change in generations, and the founding generation or older generation of family business leadership is retiring, and there's a time for new leadership coming in. Whatever it is, it can be disruptive change, and as you said, it's usually a challenge that has presented itself to an organization, but sometimes it's in the form of an opportunity, but often it's a challenge where all of a sudden the old ways of thinking, the old ways of working are no longer relevant for the current moment and for the future. And it can show up as a real, disruption, whether,
Hmm.
it's somebody in our healthcare chapter, an incident over, an incident that happened in an operating room. It might be, a family business that discovers that the way that they had been being productive and being successful is very different than what they're currently doing. In a sense, the business has changed in ways that they hadn't paid attention to. Or in higher ed, it could be some other kind of radical change where the old model of teaching and learning and research are no longer holding up. So, so it was a very motivating idea, of course, to jump ahead to the current state. You might say, certainly here in the U.S. and I know in other parts of the globe, that we're in a huge unignorable moment right now. Of course,
Hmm.
for us in the U.S., part of this comes from the change in political administration and changing, funding of certain industries in higher ed, where I do a lot of my work. Of course, the attacks on higher education from the administration, but also from the broader public, in which there's more distrust in higher ed. There's more there's funding being taken away. Some of the research models
Hmm.
are no longer working. So today we're in another kind of unignorable moment. So that the
Yes.
phrase and the idea of an unignorable moment, was relevant when we wrote the book, but it's kind of continues to be relevant. And we talk to colleagues, they'll sometimes use that phrase to say, yeah, we have a moment we can't ignore within our own organization. And then, as you say, Oscar, the question there is, what does the organization do when it faces an unignorable moment? And sometimes organizations try to get past that moment by, moving quickly or projecting a kind of solidity that maybe they don't have. Sometimes they ignore the fact that they're in that moment. But our counsel, as you said, is to really use these unignorable moments as an opportunity, right? As an opportunity to reflect on your culture, to reflect on your strategy. And we think culture and strategy are very closely related processes. And to take stock of where you are, not to rush through the moment, but to really leverage that time. And in that old phrase in business and in politics as well, never let a crisis go to waste, right? So if you have a crisis, use it as an opportunity to think, to examine where you are, and to think about the future in ways that might be creative and productive.
Yeah, I think that's very key. I mean, the title itself is that don't waste those unignorable moments. Use it as a compass to really reroute your organization, to change your business model, or to question. But what I really like is the anthropological approach, because the most of the organizations who don't know anything about anthropology, they use scientific management, or they use certain kinds of tools in order to fix the problem. Maybe by using a new SaaS, a new software, or nowadays with artificial intelligence, they want to eradicate the challenge of the problem. But I think the work that you do with by looking at the cause, the origin, by deep listening, by doing ethnography, I think that's very key. Can you tell us more about this? Maybe with an example, with any of the example of the book?
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, I think it is something that's distinctive about, as you said earlier, bringing a kind of social scientific lens to the work of business. And, it's one of the nice things working at CFAR in the setting we work in. We have a combination of people from different backgrounds. So I and some colleagues bring a social science background. We have people who have an MBA and bring a very great business training. We have psychologists who bring the psychological perspective. So I think it's the combination of those perspectives that can be very powerful. What anthropology allows you to do is to really get inside the culture and the organizational dynamics, and to understand, to bring forward a real strong organizational diagnosis. So, there's a phrase that I know you and I kicked around when we talked earlier about from Peter Drucker, that culture eats strategy for lunch or strategy for breakfast. The idea here is that culture is a very powerful force in organizations. And even though it sometimes doesn't get the kind of attention it deserves, it really can shape the success of an organization. And, you can have the best strategy, and this is what I think Drucker was getting at. You can have the best strategy on paper or the best strategy ideas, but if you don't have a culture that can take that strategy forward, and a culture that's aligned to the strategic change you need, then it's not worthy of having that great strategy. And an example that we use in the book is in the opening chapter, when there's an incident in an operating room in a hospital, a client that actually my colleague Mal had been working with, where there's a blow up in the operating room, and a fight really between a surgeon and one of the other members of the medical team. And this really did happen. We don't name the client there, but it did happen. And in that case, here, what was supposed to be a very collaborative environment in the surgical suite so that you get the best of everybody's thinking, including, the surgeon who's leading the operation, but also the nurses, the medical technicians who are part of that care team. The model was trying to move to an interprofessional, collaborative situation, but the old world culture of healthcare, which was true then and probably still true to some extent now, which is a kind of hierarchical culture in which the physicians, and here particularly surgeons, are the captain of the ship, and they're the only ones who really have that lens to bring to a situation that was still present in this team. And when one of the medical technicians saw a mistake, in this case, a surgical sponge that was actually left in the body of the patient, they had to decide whether they would break with the culture and call that out and really make sure that everybody saw that and that the procedure could stop so that they could get the best outcome, right? But that went against the culture where the surgeon really felt like they had to make all the decisions and really felt embarrassed by the fact that they might have made a mistake. So there was a rubbing up of the old culture and the new culture there in healthcare. And it's a great example of how really just the experience on the ground was in conflict with the change of ways of working that were needed at the time.
Yeah, and when I read that chapter, I found it very fascinating, the narrative of how O'Connor did all this research, talking to the doctor who the surgeon and the other member of the team who tried to stop him, and the nurse. I mean, he did all these deep listening to different narratives, different discourses about what happened in the moment. And then it's fascinating that the whole context that surrounded the event had to do with this this model of more to operate in more collaborative way in order to improve patient outcomes and to improve the attention to the patients. So it's fascinating, all the complexity of different variables and different agendas that intermix,
Right.
and the way to discover this by anthropology, by to what people say and how they say it. And I really
Yes.
like one of the moments that I really liked is when O'Connor interviewed this team member who tried to stop the surgeon, and he was from I don't remember which ethnic group or which ethnicity, and he felt like, oh, are you really interested in talking to me? He felt like almost strange because it seemed that nobody cared what he thought or what was his work or his opinion, and the fact
Yeah.
that in this case a consultant, a researcher, wanted to hear his story was like, really? Are you serious? Do you
Right.
really care what I think or what I say?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no, and I think that's
Mm-hmm.
right. It's something that, as anthropologists, you and I know that there are a lot of points of view in any situation, and they're all
Mm-hmm.
relevant, right? It's not just a top-down understanding that we need. And of course, leaders are really important. We don't deny the importance of leadership, but there are people with points of view in the middle of the organization that are very influential, and then frontline workers who are really at the edge of what's going on in the organization here in the surgical suite itself, they can be very influential as well. And I think that's a benefit of the sort of ethnographic point of view, is that to really understand the situation, you have to understand it from all levels and all directions and all identities, right? Because we know that we all bring our identities to our work, and that's an important part of culture. Those are our professional identities, whether it's as a scholar or a consultant or a business leader. or a physician or a nurse. All of those are relevant identities. We also bring, as you said, our cultural identities, our norms of working, how we speak to each other, how we show respect, how we appreciate each other. All of these things really shape the workplace. And if we're not attentive to all of those, then we're going to get results that aren't going to be ideal. And to borrow a phrase from some colleagues, when you think about culture, if you're not aware of culture as a leader and you don't really try to cultivate the culture that you think you need for the organization, you're going to get culture no matter what, right? So a colleague of ours says, if you don't, right, culture will happen. But a colleague says, if you don't create culture by design, you get culture by default, right? Right? And part of a leader, and this is actually an interesting thing to think about, is that a leader's job is not only to set the strategy and set the direction, but also to cultivate culture to the extent that they can, and to try to create a culture that is going to be supportive of the organization's mission, its business needs, its public understanding. All of that comes very much from culture.
Yeah, I think this is key. This is the first time I hear it, and I think this is very, very clear that the role of the leader, besides of doing a strategy and shalala, it's to cultivate culture. Otherwise,
Yeah.
you're gonna get culture by default.
Yes, it's a great phrase, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, yes, it's really a very great
Yeah.
phrase.
An example of this, if it's okay to raise, is you mentioned drawing on work we do. So CFAR does a lot of work with professional societies and professional associations, and by that we mean across industries, really, associations of leaders in that industry that really help set policy and advocate for the industry. The associations might be involved in learning and research. They play different roles. And we at CFAR will do a lot of work with association leaders, and these might be associations in healthcare or in education or in business. And it was interesting, we have a group of association CEOs that we gather with every few months and bring together. And we had a convening of our group of CEOs yesterday, and the theme of the conversation was about trust. And it was a fascinating conversation because, having trust in the workplace is critical. We think that's, part of culture, right? Culture shapes trust in many ways. It's also, the role of the leader to maintain trust. And associations have a very, public face. They're externally facing, and they really represent the industry. And it was fascinating to have this group of CEOs talk about times when they felt like the organization and sometimes themselves had lost trust, either lost the trust of their members, lost the trust of patients, if it's a healthcare association, society, or even lost the trust of the public. So it's an interesting example of where culture and cultures that maybe hopefully are supporting trust can break down and really get in the way of the organization's success. So that was just just something to draw on from our work. And of course today, if you look at healthcare, a lot of trusted institutions have, for various reasons, lost the sense of public trust. The debates in the U.S. around vaccines, for instance, and the way that the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, used to be a very trusted organization and represented the best thinking of healthcare and medicine, now is not seen as being as trusted, and has actually had a lot of breakdowns in trust and culture and leadership at the organization. So anyway, one example of where culture, and here a culture of trust, of safety, has broken down in the U.S. and is going to need to be addressed over time.
Yeah, do you have do you have a project that you expect to do more anthropological research to address this issue of trust?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, well, we have worked on this a bit with our association colleagues, and what we, and this is really working across a number of associations, and we did a study. This was more of a research project, but we did a study looking at how associations responded to political issues. So here the question was if there's a political issue that somehow is in the domain of your association, what should you do? Should you make a public statement about that issue? Should you not make a public statement? What kind of statement might you make? We have a white paper we've written on this topic that I'm happy to share with you because we talked to a number of association leaders across the country and even outside the U.S. And it was fascinating to hear people talk about it because often what happens is around the political issue, and it might be an important political issue, the conflict in the Middle East, for instance, or a shooting in, a violent incident. And the question really
Or the
is...
ice problem, the ice issue, the ice issues?
Yeah, this came up yesterday in our conversation, exactly. What do associations do about, the potential threats to their workers through ICE, and also the politics of that. It's a very tricky thing for association leaders, for any leaders, to figure out how to navigate. And we heard from them, some really challenging incidents. I mean, there's one story that came up where this was around the conflict in the Middle East. There was pressure from some members of the association. I won't mention what profession, but there was pressure on the leadership and the board to make a public statement about this and to come out on one side or the other, right? But what happened in this incident was that one of the board members just decided to make a public statement on behalf of the board and didn't check with the CEO of the organization, didn't go through a careful decision-making process, and wound up, posting a response to the public situation, and all of a sudden, everything blew up, and there were, social media posts, and emails, and questions of the leadership, and the CEO didn't even have a chance to consult to the board chair here about whether it was a good idea to post on this. So it's an example of where, in some ways, it's the idea of an unignorable moment. Here, an unignorable moment came because they acted without proper deliberation, and so it's a fascinating example, and it's a challenging situation. What we've learned from some of the leadership has gone through this process, and in fact, even this association, they've now put in place some policies where they have some guidance about whether they should make a statement or not. So, for instance, one of the ideas of guidance is if the incident is something that we have special expertise about. So, if take an example, it's in our paper where the idea of violence, shooting a public, a publicly shared notion of shooting incident. Well, there, and you could ask questions about gun control and appropriate measures, but there, a surgical society decided that they actually didn't want to come out and make a statement because it was in their professional arena. They have to deal with, victims of gun violence all the time, and they felt like they had research and had a lot of background here, so they did want to say, okay, that's in our area to make a statement about. But another society that might not do any work on politics, was asked to make a statement about the war in the Middle East, and they said, no, we're not going to make a statement. It's not our domain to speak to this. We don't have expertise in that area. And we heard this notion of that came up as a kind of practice of strategic silence, and that actually sometimes the strategic thing to do is to not say anything, right? Even if your membership half your membership wants you to come out on one side, the other half wants you to come out on the other side. There, maybe the best choice is not to make a statement if it's not an area that you have expertise in. So anyway, it was fascinating to do this as a kind of research project with some of our association clients to really help them think about what are the best practices that work for your organization, making these kinds of decisions. If that makes sense.
Yeah, let me make a comment about this because I remember to have read somewhere in the internet about this discussion whether companies, organizations should make a political statement about any issue, whether it's ICE, the war in Iraq, or Trump's policy, whatever. So there was this heated debate, and and there was this argument that I really liked. It says that, well, let's say a CEO might say, well, I, I can certainly have an opinion, a personal opinion about whatever issue. But as an organization, we are devoted to our customers, to our clients, our so whatever we do is to benefit our clients, to provide more value. So if we're going to make a statement, will it really help? Will it really benefit our clients? Will it really push us forward to fulfill our mission? Or is it will just take us away from, or will just distract us?
Yes,
and I think that's really interesting. I really like that approach. What are your thoughts?
Well, no, I think that's right. I think that's a great approach. And I'll give you another, a counter example where we were talking with, in this project, we were talking with a leader of an association of statisticians. Okay, so these are people in academia, but also people in government who work with statistics and work with data. And this colleague who I've been talking to, a very thoughtful leader, when earlier last year the Republican administration cut funding for statistical departments that created labor statistics, job statistics, the Labor Relations Board, and others, and really cut back on a lot of professional positions. It was a political issue, but also it was a funding issue for agencies that were producing data that really guided a lot of reports and information about employment and employment trends. In this case, the head of this association that represented statisticians said, yes, we actually should make a statement, because even though it's a highly political issue and we don't want to come across on one side of the political divide or the other, here it does affect our profession. And in a sense, what the administration is saying is we don't think statistics is valuable, or we don't think data is valuable, and they are committed to data as a useful tool for decision making in policy and economics, etc. So they actually decided to make a statement, and they made a thoughtful statement, and they felt like it was the right thing to do. So yeah, it's a fascinating conversation about this sort of the intersection of strategy, policy, and culture, I would say, about when you make a statement and when you don't.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, I really like the intersection between strategy, culture, and survival, the survival of the organization itself.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, is there another case that you will be willing to share with us where you use anthropology and anthropological methods, whether it is deep listening or ethnography?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting right now, and I'll be a little cautious because this is a live case right now. But higher education, as you know, in the U.S. is also under attack by the administration, and is how to figure out how to respond, how to be thoughtful at this moment, and
Okay.
and it's creating some real significant pressure and change for higher education. And you might argue some of that is positive, that higher ed has not changed a lot over time, and maybe it is time to change in higher education. But you also might argue that there's a lot of politics behind that, and organizations have to be thoughtful about how they change, and when they change, and how they go about the change process. So we're involved in a couple of projects, and there's one that we're talking with an organization now that is going through a major restructuring of parts of the university. They're really reorganizing, or starting to reorganize the university. And they're doing it partly because of financial pressure, partly because, there's some good opportunity for change. So our discussions right now, really at the early stages of this, is, if we were to work with them, how would we use our ability to listen in, to understand what's happening on the ground, to use that diagnosis capabilities that we talked about earlier, but then also to facilitate conversations about cultural change for the institution, so that they're really being thoughtful about how culture might have to adapt to some new ways of working, new ways of collaborating. How could they do that in a positive way? Now, in higher education, there's often a lot of resistance to change, as there is in any institution, any industry. Higher ed, there might be more than other institutions, because higher ed changes somewhat slowly. But here's an opportunity to help a higher ed institution really think about how to embrace this moment of change and make it into a positive experience for people. We know there are people who are not going to like all the changes, but can you use this? And this is that idea, again from the book, about how to use a challenge to create a great future. Our subtitle of the book is "When Big Trouble Leads to a Great Future." So here you have a situation where that could lead to a lot of trouble, and could be a lot of conflict and a lot of disagreement and people being resistant to change. How do you flip that so that people see it as an opportunity to make positive change, not losing everything that they care about, of course, but also maybe embracing some new ways of working and new ways of collaborating that might ultimately help the institution, help their students, help the research that they do, and help the world. So it's an interesting moment where culture and strategy are very tightly connected here, and I think bringing that culture lens and that ethnographic lens could be very helpful for them.
Can you tell us more about this process? And
Yeah.
I'm interested in the intervention. You do the
Yeah.
deep listening, the diagnosis, and then how do you facilitate conversations within the organization in order
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question.
to create
Because you're right.
change?
It's a great question, because as consultants, the diagnosis and the discovery work is important. But if you just stop there, you're not really helping the organization,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah, it's like
we're not
it's like when you go to
Yeah.
the doctor, it's like, oh, sorry, you have cancer, but that's it. I mean, if they don't give you the treatment.
Right, that's right. But just as an aside, I know in my own career, it was an important shift as I moved from academia to consulting to think, okay, it's not just useful to be smart or to have the best, idea, but you really have to help the client. We're in the helping business, right? So I think to your point, we use methods that once we have some understanding of what's going on in the organization, then we begin to help them shape that change. And the two methods, we have several, but two that I'll mention to you, that I think are helpful. One is to try to get the organization, and particularly the leadership, to agree on the cultural direction that they think is most important right now. So what are the cultural priorities, right? Often organizations will talk about their strategic priorities, but are they really talking about the cultural priorities? What's the culture that will enable the strategy that they want to bring about? So in this case, with this higher ed institution, an example might be, are they in agreement about what kind of culture they want? Do they want a more innovative culture? Do they want a more collaborative culture? Do they want people to work more across silos, etc.? So that, so to get there's a very simple tool we use that we call from to. So from F-R-O-M, from where are we today, and to where do we want to be in the future.
Okay.
So, and we'll get a group together. It might be a leadership team. It might be, a group of leaders together. It might be within a unit. And we say, okay, let's look at some dimensions of the culture today and say, where are we now? That's the from. And where do you want to go on those dimensions? So, for instance, I'll give you an example. Maybe today our decision-making processes are slow and not understood by people in the organization. And in the future, we want to be able to make decisions more quickly, thoughtfully, but more quickly, and we want to be transparent about those decisions. So that would be a cultural shift, right? From where we are now and to where we want to go. Another example might be in higher education. Right now, we are very driven by our departments and our divisions and our schools. We're siloed, and in the future, we want to be more interdisciplinary. We want to work across silos, across the departments, etc. Maybe we don't even want to have departments. So that would be a second kind of shift that you'd want to make. And if you engage a group in a conversation about from and to, you'll find that it's fascinating what comes out. And usually people have some common understandings about where we are today. There might be some disagreements as well. But when you think about where do we want to go to, they're not very clear about that necessarily. There might be differences amongst people, and having a conversation so that as a leadership group first, you're starting to set that cultural direction. Here's what we aspire to. Here's what we want to move to. So that's one process we use. If that makes sense.
Oh yeah, that's very, very helpful because all the actors involved, all the leaders involved, even if they don't agree to what's the final destination or the culture they want to be, at least they can ventilate the different perspectives and different views that each leader has. So it's like, oh my God, you think that way? Oh, that's interesting. I would have never thought that way.
Exactly. Yeah, and then you can really have a good conversation about culture. Both current state and what you aspire to. Right. So that's one tool. And if I could share another one, and this one, is somewhat distinctively something that our group came up with, although there are others that have similar ideas. And this is an idea, it's in the book. The idea is called found pilots. And the notion is that any change that you want to make, right? It could be a strategic change, it could be a cultural change, it could be a behavioral change. There are already examples of people who are living in that future state or working in that future state that exists today. And there's a wonderful phrase by a science fiction writer, an American science fiction writer named William Gibson. And I don't know if you read science fiction or bump into it much, but William Gibson has written some very interesting science fiction. And he has a phrase that says, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. So sit with that for a second. The future is already here, it's unevenly distributed. So the idea here is that in any organization, there are examples of teams, individuals, units, maybe even whole parts of the organization, functions that are doing things in an innovative way. And that innovative way is aligned with the future you want. So, for instance, if we went back to, the idea of That's right. The idea of being more inclusive in your hiring practices, right? Something that a lot of organizations want to do, but not an easy change to make. So if we were looking at that change, we might ask the organization, okay, let's identify some found pilots. Who are some people in the organization, teams, divisions, that already have figured out how to incorporate some practices that are more future focused. They're examples of the future that exist today. And we call those found pilots. And the idea we call them, the idea of a found pilot is that it's a pilot, it's something new, it's a new behavior, but it's not a pilot that you create as a leadership group. It's actually a pilot you go out and find, and you look for people who are doing it in a new way. And then the sort of ethnographic connection is that, let's say you found some examples of found pilots, groups that are doing things somewhat differently, innovatively. As an anthropologist, your work is to really study them and look at them, interview people on the team, say, how have you done this? Why did you make this change? How is it working? What are some challenges you have to work through? Because the found pilots don't have to be perfect. They might be examples or fragments of the change you want to see. But how do you make this work right now? And the beauty of that kind of thinking is that when you think that way and you're looking for found pilots, you're already beginning to build some momentum for change. Because if you can find these pilots, learn from them, and then extend them, you're going to accelerate change much more quickly than if you had to create everything from scratch. So found pilots is another tool that we use to help change happen, if that makes sense.
I have a question in this regard. In your experience,
Yes.
is there always found pilots in an organization, or which you find them through ethnographic research or through anthropological
Yeah.
methods,
Yeah.
or sometimes there are no found pilots and you have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak?
Yeah. On a rare occasion, you might get that there's no found pilots, but we find that almost always organizations are able to identify found pilots. And what often happens is when we bring this up, sometimes an organization, if they're feeling very stuck and feeling very challenged, then they might say, no, there's nothing here. Everybody's struggling. We don't have anybody who's doing that. But then you get them to think a little bit more, maybe talk to some other colleagues, go to other parts of the organization and ask, well, who are some groups that are working in this new way? You'll almost always find it in our experience. So sometimes it takes a little while, takes a little exploration, but almost always, particularly in a good-sized organization, you're going to find some helpful found pilots to build on and learn about.
Yeah, and I think that your work as an anthropologist is to make these pilots visible to the rest of the organization, right?
Exactly, that's right. Make them visible. You figure out how to learn from them. You bring people along with you. You champion them. You say these are people who are doing great things. Let's learn from them. You make them part of your change coalition because they're people who are future thinking already who are doing this, and you might sweep them into your change effort so that they can help accelerate change for you.
And in terms of strategic change, I think for the leaders of the organization, it's very helpful to know that the change is already within the organization. It doesn't have to come from the outside, whether it's from like the consultant. Yes. It's like, the answer is already within, but we haven't seen it. But thanks to this consultant, in this case Barry and his people and his team, is helping us to really see, and therefore we can be more empowered by
that's completely true, and it's interesting. Yeah, no, you're completely right, because what often happens in organizations, if you want to make change, one of the methodologies that is kind of considered best practice is to look for best practices, right? So you might say, let's say we're a tech company. We say, okay, what are some best practices in our industry? You might say, okay, well, we'll look to Apple around design, or we'll look to Google around innovation, or whatever it is. And the truth is that it's very hard to be Google, right? It's very hard to be Apple. It's very hard to be Harvard if you're in higher education. And rather than look to best practices, which can be challenging and don't always work where you are, right? Those practices really grew up in a different setting, in a different culture. If you can find those found pilots in your own culture, they're much more likely to work than bringing in a best practice from another setting. And there's actually data that suggests that best practices that you try to, implant in your organization don't often work. So, yeah, you're completely right. It's much better to find innovation inside the organization.
Yeah, and also reinforces the identity within the organization.
Yes, completely. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Good.
Well, that's very powerful, Barry. That's very, very powerful.
Yeah.
Well, we are on the finishing up the conversation here, but I want to ask you. We have covered a lot of material. I've been writing, and I have 3 pages already of notes. If there's only one thing that you would like from our conversation, what would be one thing that you want them to remember?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that just to really remember the importance of culture as both an asset for your organization and as an arena to look for change opportunities, right? And culture, as we know, is complex and it can be challenging because sometimes it's hard to get your arms around and to define. But I think organizations that value culture, that are persistent about understanding their culture and staying with change, because culture change can take time, and it's not instant. You have to be persistent. You have to really cultivate the change that you want to have happen. I think, to me, that's an important takeaway. That have the patience and the persistence and the willingness to really understand your culture and understand how it has to evolve to meet the future.
Yeah, very, very powerful. Very, very powerful. Well,
Great.
Thank you very much, Barry. If there's, if people are interested in talking to you about these topics, what would be the best way to contact you?
Yes, please. Yeah, definitely. Please share my email address. Happy to meet people on LinkedIn. That's a great venue to do that. Those would, I think, be the best. That's the best social media platform for our work. And and just reach out individually. I'd love to connect with anybody in your audience. And I think it's a great podcast you have, Oscar. And really glad you invited me to participate.
No, thank you very much, Barry. And it was a fascinating conversation. We learned a lot. And as I said, I took 3 pages of notes. Oh, well, 4 pages of notes. It's very profound. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
You too, Oscar. Okay. Hope to see you soon.